when a truck sideswiped him. The truck driver jumped out and, not recognizing the heavyweight champion of the world, bawled him out. Later, Joe was asked, "Why didn't you strike him instead of smiling?" "Well," he answered, "when somebody insulted Caruso, did he sing a solo for him?" When you blow your stack, you only add to the world's pollution. The Bible says, "Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and all evil speaking be put away from you."
For your free copy of Dr. Guido's daily devotional, Seeds from the Sower, write The Sower, Mentor, Georgia, 30439.
Visit us on the web at thesower.com.
VCY America presents Crosstalk, a nationwide call-in program discussing issues that have an effect on our families, our communities, our churches, our nation, and our world. Crosstalk, an opportunity for you to voice your concerns for biblical principles. And now live by satellite and around the world on the internet at vcyamerica.org. Here is today's Crosstalk.
And friends, thank you for joining us today here on Crosstalk on VCY America. The world of sports has been assaulted by wokeness. While many Americans have used sports as a getaway from the news and pressures of the day, spectators are being bombarded with social justice messages and virtue signaling. I mean, look what Major League Baseball did recently to the city of Atlanta. Many minority-owned businesses shattered when MLB made their announcement to move to, this all-star game and activities to a city and state with just the opposite demographics as Atlanta. All because the state insisted that there be integrity in the election process. But folks, it's not just Major League Baseball. It's the NBA. It's the NFL. I mean, the sports are endless. NCAA. I mean, the American people are fed up and ratings are showing it. Look what LeBron James sent out this tweet, a photo of a police officer saying, "You're next." Even the upcoming Olympic Games, where such social justice protests are forbidden, well, athletes are being promised legal support by a global union if they do protest. According to our guest today, ladies and gentlemen, this wokeness has not only ruined professional sports, but its dangers go beyond just alienating fans. They're actually being used to fulfill a globalist ideology and the erasure of national borders. Could we say this is an effort that fits hand in glove to Agenda 2030, to a one-world government? You say that's just another in a long line of conspiracy theories, Jim. Let me say don't speak too fast to that, because the United Nations knows the power of sports. They know the power of sports to influence, and they have actually released a booklet, Recovering Better, Sport for Development and Peace. Well, joining us today, we welcome to Crosstalk Dr. Duke Pesta. He's Academic Director of Freedom Project Academy, host of the Dr. Duke Show. He's a tenured professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, a contributing journalist and writer for various publications. He's one of the nation's foremost authorities on the dangers of Common Core and the federal takeover of education. Dr. Pesta, thanks for joining us here today on Crosstalk.
Glad to be with you. Thanks for having me, Jim.
So before we get to the UN, how did we get to this point so fast in virtually every sport? I mean, look how repulsed the American people were when Colin Kaepernick was instrumental in showing disrespect for our nation's flag and for service members who gave their life for that flag, respect for our nation and disrespect for law enforcement. How did we get from that point to where we are today?
Well, I actually believe it's education. I think for three generations now, we have miseducated the kids, our own youth. We've allowed our children into public schools whose primary purpose has not been education. The biggest scam in America today is public education. Our kids we're dumping more and more by communities, but at the federal level, we're spending more on American education than ever before. Americans spend as much as any nation on earth educating our kids, and yet we get results 1/20th of what the South Koreans get. We spend a lot of money, and we know for a fact that we are not making our kids more historically aware. Our kids' knowledge of history is abominable. We're not making them better readers and writers. Their illiteracy rates are staggering. I'm an English professor. My freshmen in college have about a 7th grade reading level. We're not making them more math sufficient. So what's happening is that what are we doing in the public schools if we are not educating kids? Well, we are giving them various ideological and political positions. We have turned public schools into places of almost Soviet-like reconditioning of children. We're taking them, we're driving wedges between them and their parents. We are castigating Christianity. We are castigating independence and freedom and liberty. We're lying about the history of America. I think 3 generations of that have finally caught up with us. The generation under about 35 and 40-year-old now, they see the world in much different ways, very unpatriotic ways where critical race theory, I mean, as a university professor, I saw it back in the 80s before you actually saw it in the public schools. And all of this has finally caught up with us, I believe. And so sports, too.
Yeah, it is, and it's all throughout sports. I mean, it's permeating, and something that's hard to understand is that ratings are taking a nosedive. I mean, there's that element of the public that just says we're tired, we're frustrated, we're not going to participate, we don't want to go there and get your politically correct message, your social justice messages, but it's as if the sports venues don't care. They don't care if their ratings are taking a nosedive.
They don't care in the same way that corporate America doesn't care. I mean, let's be clear about this, that at the top levels, the organizing levels, Major League sports are primarily brands like anything else. They're selling a product. They are there's a lot in common with the owners of Major League franchises and Silicon Valley social media owners. I mean, it's what they take a long game on this, and they look down the road and they see that really important demographic. This ties into my first point. What's the demographic that business is forever talking about? The 18 to the 18 to the 35. That's the demographic everybody wants. They'll sell their soul to get that demographic. And where does the 18 to 35s in our society sit right now? Right now, they don't like capitalism. They don't understand American history very well. They are not very patriotic. They have given up more or less their religion. They see globalism as a good thing. And so they're looking down the road, Major League Baseball, basketball, and football, as well as social media and Walmart and all the big Fortune 500 companies. They see that the future is woke. They see what's going on in the schools right now. They see how being woke as companies, being woke isn't going to cost you anything but a little bit of money. If you are not woke, if you do not step lockstep in line with the radical progressive the Great Reset, if you are not in line with that, well, then your future profits are doomed, right? If we're not on board with the kids now, if we're not tying into those strains of discontent with America, apple pie, all that stuff, if we've rejected that patriotism, now they know what's going to come down the road. So they've decided to be leaders. They're the same way the social media companies are using their power to reshape and to sort of tie into what progressive government wants. The sports teams, Jim, if I may be a little bit more clear about it, they have every more reason to tie into this new wave of progressivism, given how disproportionately they are dominated. The leagues are dominated by minorities. When you think about basketball and football and to a lesser degree Major League Baseball, but all three of those major sports are dominated by non-white players primarily, particularly basketball and football. So why wouldn't they throw their entire business model behind Black Lives Matter and all that other stuff, that knowing full well that for the foreseeable future, that's what our kids are going to be learning in the schools, too, as they grow up.
Yeah, and I know, though, at the same time, there are many completely turned off to the NBA. I mean, when they came back playing and allowing players to start wearing these social justice messages, I can't breathe, justice now, Black Lives Matter, I mean, it is very much in your face of the American public in this regard, and this in-your-face politics that's coming through these sports, and I'm still trying to figure out how in the world did we get from, Major League Baseball making such a rational decision of moving from Atlanta to Denver?
Well, because it's all optics. I think the reality is that one of the consequences of the education our kids have been getting for 3 generations is they're not terribly critically aware. They're not critical thinkers. They're not they're not the kind of kids, the younger kids, who are going to track down that data, right? They don't. They don't think that way. They're not thinking, well, the Atlanta's a primarily black city. Denver, Colorado is an extremely white city. So by taking the All-Star game away from Atlanta, they don't think that far in advance. They don't put things together that way. And when you said, and I agree with you, they're taking a huge hit right now, all the major sports. But you ask yourself, is that 18-year-olds who are turning off sports, or is that your generation, my generation? My generation, I'm 53 years old. Everybody from 45 and above, they're turning off professional sports. Yeah. I'm not sure the young kids were ever really watching them all that much. In the rise of the handheld portable cell phone, where you have all that information, and where video games and all that stuff, where all that stuff lives, I'm not sure that the younger generation was really going to be watching all that much. It's we, the older generations, who are really voicing our displeasure with the politics and the way these leagues have gone.
Okay, so as we look at, even pointing fingers here, are we talking about individual athletes? You reference the corporations, we think of team ownership and so forth, but I mean, look at the, you have an athlete like Colin Kaepernick, for instance, who protested about the Betsy Ross flag being on a shoe, and all of a sudden you got the corporate America bowing to what Colin Kaepernick was saying.
Yeah, I think he is really the ideal way to talk about this. His story, I think, encapsulates better than any other one where we are today. Now, let's keep in mind that so often is the case, he was adopted by white parents. He is biracial himself. He was adopted by white parents. He was incredibly privileged growing up. He was a star athlete. He got a free ride to Stanford University. He did not live in neighborhoods that were decrepit. He did not come from the ghetto. In fact, he's about as spoiled as you can be for an athlete in this culture. And he signed a $40 million contract with San Francisco. He had a couple of good years, but his athletic prowess started to wane a little bit. He was relegated to a backup role, and so what was the next best thing? He got enough sociology classes at Stanford to be indoctrinated to be immersed in critical race theory, and so all the things that weren't going right, his demotion as a starting quarterback, and he started to look around for what he was going to do in life after sports, and he's a rich guy. He doesn't have to work again for the rest of his life. Starts making political statements. Largely ignorant political statements, by the way, too. This is what I mean by no critical thinking. When you got people like Kaepernick who are literally saying things like all cops are racist, cops are murderers, this kind of stuff is so staggeringly wrong. Everybody's statistics show that that's just not true. That black-on-black violence, black Americans are much more likely to kill other black Americans than white cops are, and it's by a huge number. Mm-hmm. But to even say that now, so Kaepernick sort of started this with the kneeling. And you're right, initially the leagues didn't like it. They weren't on the side of the players. But then I think what really turned it was Nike. Nike recognized that they were in a unique place. They are the brand across sports. Let's face it, they are the sports brand right now. Nothing else has even come close, not even Under Armour, any of the other ones. And so they decided that rather than side with the culture, let's side with the athletes because, hey, and Nike wasn't getting paid by Major League Baseball, by the NFL, by the NBA. Nike made its money off the players, and so they threw themselves behind Colin Kaepernick. They provided a brand of shoes. They gave him the equivalent of a $100 million contract to over about his $40 million sports contract, and they started selling T-shirts and shoes by the hundreds of thousands to inner-city African Americans. African Americans responded to that brand really quickly, and the more political the brand became, the more inner-city black Americans and young middle-class white kids who had been immersed in African American culture, the rap music, the sports culture, started buying these clothes. So I think Nike showed the rest of the world that if you side with radical revolutionaries, poorly educated rebels who happen to be iconic, you're going to make as much or more money.
Dr. Duke Pest, our guest here today. Folks, we're going to tie this into one world government. You say that's a pretty far stretch? Wait till you hear the information, folks. We'll discuss it right after the break. This is Crosstalk on VCY America.
Back to Genesis with Dr. John Morris, scientist and creation researcher with the Institute for Creation Research. Dr. Morris, where do fingerprints come from?
Chris, fingerprints are unique for each individual, produced by nuances in the genetic code. Now, koala bears also have fingerprints which look surprisingly like human fingerprints, even though in evolution we're not closely related to the koala bears. These are much more human-like than are those pseudo-fingerprints of chimpanzees, which evolutionists think are our closest relative. And how can that be? Evolutionists conclude koala bears and humans evolved their fingerprints independently, a convenient non-answer to evidence which fits creation and not evolution. Chris, the evidence doesn't fit evolution because evolution isn't true. We were created in God's image, separate from the animals, just like it says back in Genesis.
To learn more about creation, get our free DVD called That's a Fact. Call us at 800-628-7640 and mention the promo code FACT.
This is Crosstalk on VCY America. Dr. Duke Pest is our guest here today, and talking about sports, wokeness, and one world government. Folks, we're going to have some information here that just is mind-blowing as it relates to one world government, how this all fits into what we're seeing take place today. It is not by accident. I want you to know that. It's not by accident. It's by design. Just before we get to that, Duke, if you would, a comment here also on just the women's national soccer team. And we talked about the NBA, the Major League Baseball, NFL, etc. But the women's national soccer team is very much at the hub of all of this as well.
I think they may be the most egregious example of this. They demonstrate clearly how critical race theory, as it's been parsed in the public schools, and don't forget, critical race theory, if you strip away all the bells and whistles, it is nothing more than 150 years of socialist dialectic. In the 60s, we called this liberation theology, right? I mean, it's gone through these permutations. This is pure socialist dialectic being fed to our kids at the expense of everything else. Show you the women's soccer team. So their ingratitude is staggering to me. These are some of the best treated athletes in the world. The women's team in this country is absolutely prima donna. We give them the best of everything. The funny thing is, they're champions and the men team isn't. And one of the reasons why they're champions is because we're one of the few countries in the world that actually supports women's soccer as much as we do men. Across the Latin America world, across the African world, across the Middle Eastern world, women's sports and women's soccer gets very little attention. Those governments are not spending much money at all on women's programs. So ironically, here in the so-called patriarchal West, right, where we're so sexist, the reason that our women are so much better than most of the other teams is precisely because of how well we have fed them, how well we have trained them, how well we have supported them with medical care and the best coaches. So they're winning championships because they're playing much less well-cared-for women's teams in places like Sudan and Cameroon and Venezuela. And so rather than be grateful to America, who, despite whatever problems we may still have in terms of gender, we have gone out of our way to provide them with championship abilities. The men, on the other hand, are competing against teams in sports, male soccer teams, which are the only sports in their country, right? The only sports South Americans really care about is football, right, soccer. So the men in those countries, even tiny countries like El Salvador, who beat us in a friendly a little bit ago, even the small countries in South America, they devote so much attention to the men's teams that our men, who are as well trained as any, we just don't have the soccer culture. So here's what the women's sports team decided, the women's national team decided. We're champions and the men aren't. Therefore, we should make as much or more than the men. Turned out that they weren't getting paid, they weren't receiving as much cash for their victories as the men were receiving for their losses. And, of course, they blamed it on, thanks to critical race theory, they blamed it on sexism. Well, here's the deal. The men get 13% of all the revenue they bring in. So all the T-shirts that they sell, all the tickets that they sell, all the TV deals. The men got about 13%. Excuse me, I'm sorry, 8%. 8% the men got of all their revenue deals. So $8 out of every 100 that they sell on revenue, that they sell on advertising, they sell on clothing, whatever it is. And that's a lot of money because men's sports, even though the American team isn't that good, people still watch them. It's a global market, right? Men's soccer has many more people show up to watch men's soccer in this country than do women's soccer. It's like the NBA versus the WNBA. So men were getting 8% of all of that. Turned out the women's soccer team was already receiving 13% of all the revenue. So they were already getting 5% more. The problem was that nobody was watching. So while they were out earning the men in terms of what was available, nobody was watching the product. Nobody was buying the T-shirts. Nobody was spending a lot of money to go to the games. There were no great big TV contracts to watch women's soccer. So here you have a situation where they had a much better contractual arrangement than the men, but because nobody was interested in their sport, they weren't making as much money. And they took this to a federal court, and a federal judge threw the case out and said, this is ridiculous.
Yeah.
If you want to make more money, then just grow your sport. And rather than call it there, the women's team is now trying to get this to a higher court to protest this. And to me, this is the utter ingratitude that you see here. They're still among the most highly paid female athletes in the world. They just don't make as much as the men, and it has nothing to do with how we portion out the money. It has to do with eyes. And we and you and I both know, too, the WNBA would not exist. It would not exist if the NBA didn't subsidize it.
Right. So
big player sports and athletes are doing that. And before we move off the women's team, one quick other point. It's the level of competition, stupid, right? Keep it simple, stupid. It's the level of competition, stupid. About 3 years ago, the women's team did a friendly. The stars of the women's national soccer team, they actually played a Texas high school league team, boys team, an all-boys team. There was a soccer club in Texas. It was a pretty good team. I mean, not a great team, but they were about 15-year-old boys. And they lost 5-0 to these boys. They couldn't even score a goal against 15- and 16-year-old boys. And yet they're lecturing the world. All of this has to do with American misogyny and American dislike of women. This is the nasty imperatives of critical race theory at work.
Dr. Duke Pesta with us today. Duke, in the introduction to this program today, I alluded to the connection between what's going on in sports and what's being done to promote a one-world government, global governance, Agenda 2030. And I've got a booklet here entitled Recovering Better, Sport for Development and Peace, Reopening, Recovery, and Resilience Post-COVID-19. And on the very opening page is a foreword from Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations. And here's what he wrote. He said, quote, "Sport has often helped to create spaces for dialogue, advance gender equality, promote social inclusion, and tackle discrimination against vulnerable groups. It has played this role at all levels of society, from the smallest communities to the global village. It has provided avenues for improving individual health and community well-being. We continue to count on sport to provide this space." Duke, there's no question about it. He sees sports as the catalyst to be a change agent for society.
And, Jim, that explains something else really important, why the non-American world has been so divorced from the American sports world. The funny thing is that America, the richest country in the history of the world, the primary superpower of the last 70 years or so in the world, our sports have been our sports, right? With the exception of basketball, which was invented by an American. And finally, in the 70s, it took to the 70s or 80s, really, before the rest of the world started playing basketball seriously. You didn't have serious basketball in Europe and certainly not Asia until the mid to late 80s. And so American sports was isolated. Our sports were our sports, and that drove the globalists nuts. And so you look at soccer, how it's globally marketed and has been for like 120 years. You go back to the 1920s, you go back to the 1910s, and they were already, you have this World Cup, you have this globalization of soccer. It's the world's game. We keep hearing the statistic. Calling a Super Bowl is odd when you think about how many people from how many different countries are playing and watching every 4 years the great soccer tournament. And so our sports were our sports. And one of the things that I think they figured out, and one of the ways they did it is through this race antagonism, is how do you make American sports preeminent globally? Well, one of the things you do is you have these kinds of revolutionary moments where sports is about Black Lives Matter. Sports is about gender equality. Sports now is about trans equality. I mean, you remember ESPN a few years ago when they gave their award for courage to Caitlyn Jenner for simply having a sex change. Mm-hmm. When you had serious contested people who had given up their lives for other people, people who have transformed the lives through sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of people, they were ignored to give it to the transgender athlete, right? All of this is part of the globalist agenda, right? In the same way you want to break down borders. The biggest problem to the globalist is borders. So the more international your sport, the more less bound to a particular country or a climate or a region or a continent your sport is. The more your sport has global visibility and global fan bases, the more those athletes are furthering the mission of the UN, the disavowing of borders, the globalizing of every aspect of sport. And so now the political correct aspects of sport tie in perfectly. This is what's so frustrating. If you look at the political goals of the UN and look at the political goals now of our major sports unions, they are exactly the same thing.
They're one and the same, and you can go through these, folks, and that's what's so amazing. I mean, in this UN document on sports, they promote gender equality. Is there any, is there any mistake about it? We've got virtually every Major League Baseball team that's having a Pride Night or LGBTQ plus Pride event. I think last season or season before, it was all Major League Baseball teams but one had one. It was one of the Texas teams. But this whole thing that we're seeing with the NCAA, and we're going to pull our games out of your state if you put in these laws into place where biological boys who now become girls can't play on girls' sports teams, etc. But this is part of the UN agenda. It's right here in this document on sports. They're promoting gender equality.
Right, and it's not just what the leagues that are embracing that is very telling about this politics, but it's what they're turning their back on. They're turning their back on the national flag. They're turning their back on the national anthem. They're turning their back on military flyovers and support your local police nights. Those you won't have anymore. You will not have support. They'll come on out to the ballpark and support your local police station. Those used to be a staple of baseball games. You can't have that and then also have Black Lives Matter, right? Because Black Lives Matter, and think about how this fits the global agenda. Not only do we not want local police that are only accountable to the people who pay their salaries. We look at the push now. They want to replace local polices. They want to defund the local police, which would mean by definition you would have to then, at the federal level, have a federal police force. That's one great big step in the right direction for globalism, right? Have a nationwide federal police force who's loyal to the administration, the people in power in Washington, not to the American people. Those are the people now in Canada, by the way. Look at the stormtroopers of Canada as they're sending out SWAT teams yesterday to arrest a pastor.
Yes.
Right. So this is all part of a plan. You denounce the local. You make it global. You come after local institutions, even national institutions like the flag and the national anthem. That's what they're protesting. I was always bothered by that. There are so many ways you as professional athletes can protest without having to use game time to do it, without having to use the flag as the symbol of your dislike. I mean, I said this about Colin Kaepernick. Wouldn't he have been better served to take $20 million of his fortune and start opening soup kitchens and start opening new schools in black neighborhoods? Never did any of that. Just took off after the flag, the symbols of America. Why? This is the globalist move, right? If the flag stands for liberty and freedom and opportunity, and people all over the world have suffered to come here and have that American dream, if you can undermine those symbols, if those symbols now represent anti-blackness and anti-women and anti-gay, then you break up what makes America unusual and a destination you want to come to.
Dr. Duke Pesta with us, Academic Director of Freedom Project Academy. We're going to just talk about that a moment here after the break, as well as how COVID, yes, the Wuhan virus, being called COVID-19, is being used also as a means to accomplish their end. We'll get into that as well. It all ties in to what we're seeing happen with sports right now. We'll also give you opportunity in a short while to be calling in and participating in the discussion today with your questions. So stay with us. This is Crosstalk on the VCY America Network.
Cemeteries and mausoleums are evidence of the sad reality of death, and that each of us has a divine appointment with death. According to surveys, Americans overwhelmingly believe that heaven exists and believe that most are going there. A small number believes that hell exists, with only 0.5% believing they will go there when they die. What if those who do not believe in hell die one day and find they made a tragic and eternal mistake? In the book, Hell is for Real, author Gary Frazier discusses the separation, the suffering, and the sorrow of hell, along with future events that will unfold. There is much information given by movies, television, psychics, and even by many religious circles. Gary presents scriptural truth on this important topic. VCY is making available the book, Hell is for Real, as our way of saying thank you for your support of $15 or more. 2 copies for a donation of $25. Just ask for it when you call 1-800-729-9829.
The program is called Crosstalk. It comes your way each weekday at the same time on the VCY America Network. With us today, Dr. Duke Pesta, Academic Director of Freedom Project Academy. He also hosts the Dr. Duke Show and is a tenured professor of English at the University of Wisconsin, Oshkosh. You don't talk like most university professors, Dr. Pesta.
No, I do not, and I keep wondering when the cancel axe was going to find me. I think I give it about a 40% chance that I'll actually graduate as a professor. We'll see what happens.
So give us a word about Freedom Project Academy. I know this article that you just wrote on sports and wokeness, that's at thenewamerican.com, but you also have articles and writings and media, interviews, etc., through your organization as well.
Yeah, Freedom Project Academy, we first and foremost a complete online homeschool from kindergarten through high school. We have live classes with real live teachers teaching in real time who do all the grading and the assignment of work, and we do it right through your computer. So we can bring up the full experience of a public school into your living room. On your computer screen, you'll have students classmates from all across the country. And we are a classical school. None of this critical race theory, none of this other garbage. We're a classical school rooted in Judeo-Christian values. So we are one answer to the big problem of what's going on in the public schools. And we also have a media division where we put out 18 different programs every week, Christian and classical conservative programming, good for the family at all ages. So we're impacting the media, and we're impacting schooling as well. And
got some websites you can tell us about?
Easy. Just go to fpeusa.org. That's fpeusa.org. You can click on the media, see what's up there, and you can take a look at our school as well.
Great. fpeusa.org. Dr. Pesta, they're also using this Wuhan virus, has been called COVID-19, as a means to accomplish their end to, quote, ensure safe access to regular physical activity and mental health services in line with the World Health Organization's recommendation. I find it interesting about how they're using COVID-19, combining it with sports, and we've got to, talk about activity, physical activity, and mental health, fitness, etc. And then I also see just recently we had Andrew Cuomo announce that Yankees and Mets baseball games, fans are going to be segregated into vaccinated and unvaccinated sections starting in middle May. And matter of fact, you can come to the ballpark, get your COVID shot, and then you'll also get a ticket to a free game. But here we are using this whole means to the same end.
Yeah, I mean, it's so transparent. I mean, and the hypocrisies of this. Stay in, stay away from everybody, don't go outside, lock yourself away, wear a mask, and yet somehow find time to exercise, find time for your mental and your spiritual wellness. It doesn't make any sense. The big thing about COVID for them, whether we're talking about sports or we're talking about education or anything else, is this was a great test run to see how compliant the world would be, and especially how compliant America would be. I mean, we have never, unlike a lot of other countries in the world, we haven't been tested. Our love of liberty, our commitment to freedom, our willing to sacrifice for the Constitution and equality and free markets, we haven't really been tested about that in a long time. And what did they find out? They found out that we would be very, like every other country on earth, we would be very quick to give away our freedoms in the name of protections. We would be very quick to pull our kids out of public schools, to allow Black Lives Matter and Antifa in the streets to protest racial justice, but to disallow you and me going to church on Sunday. I mean, where is the revolution? Where is the pushback against that? I mean, it seems to me that there are still more Americans who would be fine wearing masks for the next year rather than those who want them gone now, if you look at the simple numbers. So I think they found out that globalism via media and social media and all of the international the way technology has shrunk the world over the last 25 years has done a really good job already of softening up America defenses against those who would undo liberty and individuality.
Yeah, and to keep our sports analogy, the goalpost keeps moving. I mean, Dr. Fauci just talked about, I believe it was over the weekend, about maybe by next year's Mother's Day, things are going to get back to normal. I mean, unbelievable.
Yeah. This is the same Fauci who went to go and throw a first pitch out at a Washington game, and then gleefully sitting in the stands without his mask, caught with it off. Right? Mm-hmm. This is the hypocrisy of this. The elites do what the elites do, but the rest of us are willing to be controlled by those elites, despite the fact. You mentioned a joke popped into mind. You mentioned Andrew Cuomo, and how Cuomo is going to sack at baseball games. Now, you want to go see the Yankees? There's going to be the section devoted to the vaccinated, the section devoted to the unvaccinated, but maybe they ought to reserve the bleachers for all the elderly people who could be marshaled into nursing homes and then left to die. Maybe they ought to have a third segment for Cuomo's grand schemes.
How sad. And Duke has this booklet that the UN put out. I mean, we could go through Sustainable Development Goal after Sustainable Development Goal. The SDGs are listed all in here, but they use sports as their means to an end. And I find it also interesting in all of this how they are using just whole recreation, play spaces for Sustainable Development Goal number 11 on sustainable cities and communities. I mean, they're using sports in every aspect to go the Agenda 2030, goal after goal after goal. This is their means to an end. We have what's going on in the educational system, but now also, look what's happening with Hollywood. We got the same thing going on there, but now using sports to accomplish that same end.
Well, a classic example of this is how sports are being used to destroy gender, right? I mean, what happened to the feminists? We spent 50 years in this country being lectured by ERA feminists that women need safe spaces, that women need places away from men, that we're a sexist country. We needed Title IX because women didn't have the same sporting opportunities that men did. And here we are, 2021, where women have all of those things, and we're being told now, no, now men who think they're women should be allowed to take your awards away and your ribbons and your medals away. I just read a news. Speaking of global, the Olympics, which are coming down the road, just read a really scary article where all of the Olympic athletes are being warned to say nothing about the fact that in women's weightlifting that they have a man. And weightlifting is one of those things that men just have the body mass to do differently. And so one of the contestants is now a man who has, quote-unquote, transitioned to be a woman. So he's competing, and the athletes are being warned by the people, the administrators of the Olympics, you are not to talk about this. You are not to make an issue about this. We don't care if you stand or sit. We don't care if you raise your hand or not, or ignore or kneel for a flag. But don't you dare criticize the fact that you have a man taking medals away from women because he's actually a man.
Our phone number to Crosstalk, 800-733-9829. That's 1-800-733-9829. Your questions or brief comments. Dr. Duke Pester, our guest here today on the program. Duke, I'd like to just relay something to our listeners. I don't normally do, but it was pretty profound what you and I had a conversation during the final break, and I said, I wonder if people will wake up, and you responded saying, waking up is not enough. What do you mean by that? Expound on that.
I mean, by all means, it's nice to get people aware, but at some point, being aware, there's not much you can. I mean, if you wake up at noon on Pearl Harbor Day on December 7th, 1941, you might have slept through the beginning, but there's no getting out of the nightmare, right? I mean, have we gone so far as a culture? Have we? I mean, I think a really disturbing litmus test is the mask thing, is how Americans reacted to COVID. We're willing to take a lot. We are willing to give up a lot of our freedoms to really excessive and hypocritical government programs or government initiatives, even unconstitutional ones, if we are reassured enough, right? So Fauci has never held an elective position. He has been wrong about a lot of things in the past. Much of what he said about AIDS for the first 10 years, from 1980 to 1990, was exactly wrong. Much of what he's told us over the last year and a half about COVID has been completely hypocritical and back and forth, and what he says you can't do to today, he'll turn around and say you can't do tomorrow. And yet he is a celebrity. Most Americans believe that whatever he tells you, you should do. Constitution be damned. So at some point, you're going to have more and more people waking up to the danger we're in, but they're going to wake up to a new dystopian world where there's nothing you can do to change it anymore.
Let's go to Pastor Mark in Missouri. Pastor Mark, you're on the air.
Hi, I just wanted to give a testimony to the Lord real quickly, if I could. 41 years ago, I was a TV sports director. I did 6 and 10 o'clock sports on TV. We had a 2 million viewer area. I worked 12 hours a day for 3 minutes at 6 o'clock sports and 3 minutes at 10 o'clock sports. And I was responsible to make sports viewing interesting. I found it unfulfilling. I left to go into full-time ministry, and I've been a pastor since. And I found fulfillment in serving Jesus Christ as my Lord, and serving him is a joy. And I guess my point would be, in the realm of eternity, we have put so much emphasis on how important sports is, but there's only one thing that's eternal, and that's Jesus Christ and his glory. And I wanted to point out that I started a career in sports directing as far as a sports director on a TV station, and my fulfillment is totally in Christ, and I grew up as a decent athlete. Yep. So I wanted to testify to the glory of Christ.
Thank you, Pastor Mark. Appreciate that. And yet we do see sports as being a means, a tool to reach this culture, Duke, in ways that there's powerful influence there.
Yeah, I'll give you another example. And I think for me the big takeaway about what Pastor Mark said is the overgrown role of sports in the life of American children. Look, I mean, it's one thing to be able to play on a soccer team, or to be able to be, you played high school baseball, but is it worth it at the expense of illiteracy? And is it worth it? I mean, think about moms and dads. I've heard more moms and dads lament the fact that because of COVID, our kids aren't getting their quote-unquote socialization through sports. They're worried about that. Most parents I talk about are more worried about the lost opportunity to play sports than they are even the lost educational opportunities of this. I think that there's a huge disproportion placed on sports in our schools. And when you think about how the average eighth grader, according to the last NAEP scores, the average eighth grader in this country, only about 37% of eighth graders across the country in public schools are able to do reading and math at an eighth grade level. And so we've got this huge cult of sports, this huge cult of sports, and how this idea of collectivism through sports. That's the big scary thing to me. I mean, you would think that now that how many parents have figured out how bad online schooling is as the public schools tried to do it. You'd think that a lot of moms and dads would be not looking forward to the public schools opening. They'd say, okay, we figured it out. These schools don't work. Spending all this blood and money to send their kids to public schools, and they're not getting an education. But what I'm hearing and what scares me Can't wait for the school fall sports to start. Can't wait for my kids can get back out on the basketball court or the football field. There's way too much of that and way too little focus on the education that your kids aren't getting while they're busy playing sports.
Let's go to Christine in Racine, Wisconsin. You're on the air.
Dr. Duke, you are a hero, especially in light of the fact that you are there in the war zone. You are in the indoctrination centers, speaking things that they're not heard, and you are the voice of sanity and reason. I hear you on Vicki McKenna all the time, and I just praise God for you and your courage, and I pray for you all the time, sir, because critical race theory, sir, is also in the churches. This has deluged the evangelical churches, which were supposed to be the last line of defense in our culture, and sir, we are in a world of trouble, and we have censored ourselves, and I just thank you for your voice. May it never cease.
Thank you, Christine. I'm up against a break. We'll be back with more Crosstalk in 1 minute here on the VCY America Network.
For the Worldview Report, I'm Brandon House. Our website's worldviewreport.com. My friend Alex Newman recently interviewed Dr. Peter McCullough, and we played the audio clips on radio and TV. This medical doctor is warning that the vaccine everyone's taking is for the original virus, not the other 14 strains now running around the world. He also advised that normally when a vaccine has the deaths connected to it that COVID has, it's pulled. In fact, we are now, as a broadcast date here today, at over 3,500 deaths, and that's on the extremely underreported side. But did you know that if you have 50 deaths in a normal product of vaccines, those are pulled off the market? In 1976, the swine flu vaccine was pulled after just 25 deaths. Most of these deaths are occurring within day 1, 2, or 3. He also reports that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was pulled off the market due to blood clotting, but that the blood clots caused by the other vaccines are even higher. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Crosstalk on VCY America. Dr. Duke Pest is our guest. By the way, you can read his article on sports and wokeism at thenewamerican.com, thenewamerican.com. Also, his site, fpeusa.org. The caller said critical race theory in the churches, Dr. Pesta?
Yeah, and I want to give a shout-out for Christine. Those are some lovely, lovely things she said. We appreciate that. But, yeah, she's exactly right. I mentioned at the very opening of the show liberation theology. Remember in the 60s, liberation theology, it was the appropriating of Christian truth by Marxist dialectic. Give an example. You've got a critical race theory pope right now. Pope Francis was educated in the socialist fever swamps of South America. You look at his agenda, you look at his comments, you look at his behavior, he is much more interested in what you and I would call social justice than he is gospel justice. There's no doubt about that. And so in the 60s, that was called liberation theology. It was when Marxism hijacked the truths of Christianity. Interesting, too, it was that generation of priests, of seminary priests, that turned out to be the molesters of children because they weren't signing up priests to be true gospel warriors. They were signing up a new kind of priest to seminary in the seminary. They were these social justice priests who wanted to come in not because they believed in the gospel, but because they wanted to use the power of churches like the Catholic Church to change culture. So that's been around for a long time, and it's around today.
Let's go to Spokane, Washington. Ryan, you're on the air.
I wanted to briefly speak with Duke here on the matter of critical thinking. And my understanding is that he is a published academic. Is that correct?
I have had to publish books for my tenure. Yes, I have published books. Yes, sir.
Okay, and then we had touched on the critical thinking, the lack of critical thinking in academic institutions. I did want to mention to you that James Naismith was born and raised in Canada. It's not Kaepernick, it's Kaepernick, and he did not go to Stanford. He went to Nevada. Just a few things you might want to consider before you start talking about these things.
Sure, yeah. I'm not bothered by mispronouncing Kaepernick's name. Naismith may have been born in Canada, but it was an American game. And as far as Nevada goes, you got me. Congratulations.
Gary in Mesa, Arizona, you're on the air.
Yeah, hey, thank you very much for putting me on the air. I heard something really distressing about the Disney Corporation has gone completely over the edge on this counterculture. If there's anything systemically wrong in this nation, it's the rise in anti-Semitism and the rise of white hatred sponsored by these people who claim to be in favor of unity. And I want to thank your program and your guests for keeping us online and keeping us all straight. Thank God we don't have to win a popularity contest to get into heaven. Thank you.
Thank you for the call here.
And that is a great point. If you look at what the Disney Channel has become on cable TV, it is staggering how anti-kid it is. What used to be one of the most wholesome channels with, you had the Mickey Mouse Club, has become really a petri dish for sexual experimentation, for transgenderism, for homosexuality. And, of course, as I think the caller's referring to the fact that in the Walt Disney in California, I believe it is, just opened, and they're doing critical race training for all of their employees. So you want to work as Cinderella, you want to work as selling cotton candy at Disneyland, you're going to have to go through a very rigorous self-appraisal if you're white. It's very, very Soviet, these trainings, these racist trainings that you're getting for the critical race theories as well.
We're going to get one last call in. Brad in West Allis, you're on the air.
Hey, Brother Jim. All this stuff, the critical race theory, the vaccines, the woke religion, it's for chaos, population reduction, and false teaching. And as for this thing about, the schools are out during the COVID thing, it's kind of a blessing in disguise because they weren't getting an education before, and they're not getting it now, or during the time when the schools are out. And they didn't get in the summer anyway, but they didn't get indoctrinated either in the classroom. So that's an opportunity. People need to start teaching their kids at home again.
Thank you, Brad.
Thank you.
This whole aspect of sports and wokeism, it is very involved. And when we see what's taking place, every one of these, well, not every one, but a good majority of these sustainable goals that have been put out by the UN they fit hand in glove to what they're doing now in sports. But it's not just sports. It's also coming out through education. It's coming out through corporate America. It's coming out through Hollywood entertainment. On and on it goes to make that influence. Dr. Pester, we have just 2 minutes remaining here. And in all of this, there is great hypocrisy. Take the NBA, for instance.
Yeah, we had a caller call a few minutes ago trying to play the hypocrisy card. Let's play this one. You got a NBA that is so woke. It's of all the major sports league, it is the blackest league, and so they're talking incessantly about how hard it is to be black in this country, while they're earning billion-dollar contracts in the case of LeBron James, worth $1 billion. So they're talking about how hard it is to be black in America. Meanwhile, their league operations in China are growing every year stronger. Their ties to China and Chinese markets, making more money off Chinese markets. And there's a country that is systematically engaging in all sorts of genocidal behavior. A number of organizations have labeled what the Chinese are doing to the Uyghurs to be actually genocide. They are profit. Who's making these basketballs and these tennis shoes that these black NBA stars are making so much money off of? It's slave labor in China. If you're going to call out how bad it is, if you made $1 million as an American athlete, as an African-American athlete, you made $1 billion playing pro basketball, and you want to call out how bad America is, but you got nothing to say about China and what it does to political dissidents, what it does to the Uyghurs, what it does to Christians. You got nothing to say about that? You're willing to take that blood money and then turn around and attack the country that gave you the freedom and opportunity to do it? Those kind of gotcha things are pretty sad, and that's a big deal when you stop and think about this. You're willing to look at the depredations that China does. Nobody kills more people nobody kills more of their own people every year than the Chinese. And this is who you are arguing has some kind of is on a same moral plane with the United States. It's absolutely outrageous, but that's what these high-level sports you see why that appeals to the UN, right? The UN, who do we've got on the Women's Commission now? You've got the Iranians, I believe it is. Iran's on the Commission of Women's Rights now at the UN. So when you think about how the UN mocks justice and puts these undemocratic countries on charge of all of these human rights issues, and then you turn around and look at how the NBA is dealing with China, there's a whole lot of parallelism right there.
Dr. Duke Pester with us today. Again, his article, Woke Sports, at thenewamerican.com, his website, fpeusa.org. Dr. Pesta, thanks so much for being with us today.
Anytime, Jim. Thank you very much.
And folks, thanks for joining us today on Crosstalk.
You've been listening to Crosstalk via satellite and the internet from VCY America. Views expressed may or may not be those of this station. For a CD of today's program, send a donation of $6 or more to VCY Tape Ministry, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53208. Or download by RSS or podcast from crosstalkamerica.com. And join us again for Crosstalk.